A virgin was imprisoned in a barn as punishment, but a lone cowboy freed her and shocked everyone. The barn door creaked open like a coffin lid. Morning light carved through the darkness, revealing a silhouette against the blazing sun. Dust motes danced in the golden shaft, and somewhere in the shadows chains rattled against wood. The cowboy's boots struck the floorboards with the weight of judgment itself. His weathered hand gripped the doorframe, knuckles white as bone, as he stared into the darkness where innocence had been caged like a wild animal. The smell of hay mixed with fear and shame hung thick in the air. Outside, the town held its breath, waiting for the explosion that would shatter their twisted sense of justice. When a community condemns an innocent soul to darkness and humiliation, would you walk past in silence, or would you risk everything to tear down the walls of cruelty? The entire frontier was about to learn that sometimes one man's conscience burns brighter than 1,000 torches of mob justice. But what happened in the next heartbeat would brand this moment into the soul of every witness, forever changing what courage means on the unforgiven plains. 3 days earlier, the sun had kissed the horizon with the gentleness of a mother's touch, painting the endless grassland in shades of amber and gold. Thomas McKenna rode his painted mare along the familiar trail that bordered Millbrook, a settlement carved from the stubborn earth by folks who believed hard work could tame any wilderness. His calloused hands held the reins with practiced ease, and his gray eyes surveyed the land he'd called home for 15 years. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers and distant cooking fires, a peaceful symphony that had always soothed his restless heart. Thomas lived alone in a modest cabin 2 miles from town. Very fast-paced after losing his wife Sarah to fever 3 winters past. Solitude had become his companion, broken only by weekly trips to Millbrook for supplies and the occasional drink at Murphy's saloon. The townspeople respected him as a man of few words but steady character, someone who kept his promises and minded his own business. His daily routine was simple: tend his small herd of cattle, repair fences, read by lamplight, and remember Sarah's laughter in the evening stillness. But on this particular morning, as Thomas guided his mare toward town, the usual tranquility felt different, heavier, like storm clouds gathering on a clear day, promising trouble that hadn't yet shown its face. The birds seemed quieter, and even the grasshoppers had ceased their endless chirping. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to shatter the fragile peace of Millbrook. If stories like this speak to your heart, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next powerful tale of courage against impossible odds. As Thomas approached the town's main street, he noticed an unusual gathering near the church. Voices rose and fell like an angry tide, and he could see Pastor Williams gesturing emphatically at the crowd. Women clutched their shawls tighter, whispering behind gloved hands, while men shifted their weight from boot to boot, jaws set with grim determination. Thomas dismounted and approached carefully, his instincts warning him that whatever had stirred this hornet's nest ran deeper than simple gossip. The crowd parted reluctantly as he moved closer, revealing the source of their agitation. In the center of the circle stood Elena Vasquez, barely 18 years old, with tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves around her shoulders, and her simple brown dress was torn at the sleeve. Thomas had seen her before, working as a seamstress for Mrs. Henderson, always quiet and polite, sending most of her earnings back to her aging parents in Mexico. She stood with her head bowed, trembling like a cornered deer, while the voices of judgment crashed over her like waves against stone. Pastor Williams raised his hand for silence, his normally gentle face twisted with righteous anger. His voice carried the weight of divine authority as he proclaimed, This woman has brought shame upon our Christian community. She has defiled herself with sin and corruption, and by God's word, she must face the consequences of her wickedness." The crowd murmured agreement, nodding heads like wheat bending in a cruel wind. But Thomas had seen Elena's face, had caught the flash of pure terror and confusion in her dark eyes. This was not the expression of a woman caught in sin, but of an innocent soul trapped in a nightmare beyond her understanding. Something cold settled in his chest as Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her voice sharp as broken glass. "She was found in the company of that Mexican bandit Rodriguez, in a compromising position. The evidence of her shame is clear to anyone with eyes to see." Elena's voice rose like a wounded bird's cry, desperate and pleading. "I was gathering herbs for my mother's medicine. He attacked me, but I fought him off. I swear on my mother's grave I am innocent of any wrongdoing." But her words seemed to fall on ears made deaf by prejudice and fear. The crowd's judgment had already been passed, swift and merciless as a winter storm. Thomas felt something stir in his chest, a familiar ache that reminded him of every injustice he'd witnessed but been too afraid to challenge. The crowd was preparing to drag Elena toward the old barn at the edge of town, the place where the community stored grain and sometimes held difficult prisoners. Pastor Williams declared that 3 days of isolation and prayer would either cleanse her soul or reveal her true corruption to God's eyes. But Thomas McKenna had seen enough broken spirits in his lifetime to recognize innocence when it stood trembling before him. His decision formed like steel cooling in a blacksmith's forge, hard and unbreakable. His conscience would not allow him to watch this travesty unfold without action. Elena Vasquez was about to disappear into the darkness of mob justice, but her ordeal would soon reveal something far more dangerous than one man's compassion. As the crowd began to move toward the barn, Thomas followed at a distance, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. The structure loomed before him like a monument to cruelty, its weathered boards gray as tombstones in the morning light. Heavy iron bolts secured the doors, and the windows had been boarded shut to prevent escape or communication with the outside world. This was not imprisonment, it was burial alive. The men of the town worked with grim efficiency, fitting the iron chains to the door and checking the locks twice. Eleanor was thrust inside with no ceremony, her final pleading cries cut short by the slam of heavy wood. Pastor Williams offered a brief prayer asking for God's judgment to fall upon the sinner, while the women whispered among themselves about the wages of sin and moral corruption. Thomas watched from the shadow of Miller's feed store as the crowd gradually dispersed, satisfied that justice had been served. But the cold knot in his stomach only grew tighter as he thought of the young woman trapped in that airless prison, guilty of nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong moment. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and Thomas knew that by evening the barn would become an oven of heat and despair. If your whole town had turned against an innocent soul, would you risk everything to stand alone against their judgment? Or would fear keep you silent while cruelty masqueraded as righteousness? That night, Thomas sat in his cabin, unable to eat or find peace in his usual evening routine. Sarah's photograph on the mantelpiece seemed to watch him with gentle reproach, reminding him of the vows they'd made together to always stand for what was right, regardless of the cost. Through his window, he could see the distant outline of the town, and somewhere in that darkness, Elena Vasquez spent her first night in captivity, probably wondering if anyone in the world still believed in her innocence. The hours crawled by like wounded animals. Thomas paced his small cabin, wrestled with his conscience, and finally made a decision that would echo through the rest of his life. Just before dawn, he saddled his mare and rode toward town, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The world was still gray with pre-dawn shadows when he approached the barn, moving like a ghost through the sleeping settlement. The barn sat in heavy silence, surrounded by the whispered breathing of a town lost in dreams. Thomas dismounted and approached the massive doors, his boots crushing dew-wet grass beneath each careful step. The iron chains gleamed dully in the fading starlight, cold and unyielding as the hearts of those who had placed them there. From inside came the faintest sound, a woman's voice, soft and broken, praying in Spanish to a God who seemed to have abandoned her to darkness. Thomas examined the locks with the eye of a man who had worked with iron and wood his entire life. The chains were heavy, but the bolts that held them had been installed hastily, more for show than security. His leather-work gloves muffled the sound as he worked the first bolt loose, then the second, his movements precise and silent as falling snow. The chains clinked softly as they fell away from the door, and Thomas felt his chest tighten with the weight of what he was about to unleash upon his quiet world. The door opened with a groan that seemed to split the morning air like thunder. Helena appeared in the opening, squinting against a pale light, her face streaked with tears and dust, but her dark eyes blazing with a dignity that imprisonment could not break. She stared at Thomas as if he were an angel descended from heaven, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the magnitude of the moment settling between them like a challenge to destiny itself. "Senor McKenna," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying and thirst, "why do you risk yourself for me? They will destroy you for this kindness." Thomas looked into her eyes and saw the truth that the town had been too blind to recognize. Innocence as pure as mountain snow, courage that had survived a night of hell, and a spirit that would rather die than yield to injustice. His voice came out rougher than he intended, weighted with years of silence and regret, because sometimes a man has to choose between being safe and being right. "Miss Vasquez, and I've been safe for too long." He offered her his hand, and she took it like a drowning woman grasping a rope, her fingers trembling but her grip strong as steel. But as they stepped into the growing light of dawn, Thomas realized that freeing Elena was only the beginning of their troubles. The town would wake soon, and when they discovered the empty barn and broken chains, their fury would fall upon him like wolves upon a wounded elk. His act of mercy had just declared war on everything Millbrook claimed to believe about justice and order. If you stood alone against a mob's fury, would surrender feel safer than the fight that honor demands? The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the morning stillness like gunshots in a cathedral. Thomas turned to see Sheriff Coleman riding hard from town, his face set with the grim determination of a man who'd been awakened by angry voices and demands for immediate action. Behind him rode Pastor Williams and 3 other men, their horses' hooves pounding the earth like drums of judgment. Elena gasped and moved closer to Thomas, her slight frame trembling against his solid presence. Sheriff Coleman reined his horse to a sliding stop, dust billowing around him like smoke from a battlefield. His weathered hand rested on his pistol grip as his pale blue eyes took in the scene. The open barn door, the fallen chains, and Thomas standing protectively beside the woman the town had condemned. The sheriff was a fair man by nature, but years of keeping peace in a frontier town had taught him that sometimes fairness had to bow to necessity. "Thomas McKenna," the sheriff said, his voice carrying the weight of official authority and personal disappointment, "you've overstepped yourself this time. This woman was lawfully detained by decision of the church council and the good people of this town. By what right do you interfere with justice?" His words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, bitter and heavy with consequences. Thomas felt Elena's hand slip into his, her fingers ice cold but steady as stone. He straightened his shoulders and met the sheriff's gaze without flinching, his voice carrying 15 years of earned respect in this community. By the right of 10th Christian man to prevent innocent blood from being shed, Sheriff. This girl is guilty of nothing more than being Mexican and defenseless in a town that's forgotten the difference between justice and vengeance. Pastor Williams spurred his horse forward, his normally gentle features twisted with righteous indignation. The morning sun caught the silver cross on his chest, sending beams of light dancing across the dusty ground like fragments of broken promises. McKenna, you fool! You've been bewitched by this woman's foreign ways and sinful nature. She was found in corruption with that bandit Rodriguez, and the evidence of her shame will soon be visible to all eyes. You risk your soul and your standing in this community for a harlot's lies. But Elena stepped forward then, her small chin raised with pride that imprisonment couldn't break, her voice carrying the ring of absolute truth. Pastor Williams, you speak of evidence, but you never asked to hear my voice. That man Rodriguez attacked me while I gathered medicine herbs for my sick mother. I fought him off with a rock and ran, but not before he tore my dress and left bruises on my arms. If shame has been brought upon anyone, it was brought upon me by his violence and your refusal to listen to truth. Thomas saw something flicker in the sheriff's eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or the recognition that a frightened girl's words carried more honesty than a crowd's accusations. But Pastor Williams seemed deaf to anything that contradicted his predetermined judgment, his face flushing red with stubborn conviction. The tension stretched tight as a bowstring ready to snap when the sound of many horses filled the air. From the south came a cloud of dust that seemed to swallow the morning light, and beneath it rode at least 20 men, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim as granite. At their head rode a man Thomas recognized with a chill that ran straight to his bones. Captain Mendoza of the Mexican Rurales, Elena's older brother, whose reputation for swift justice had made him a legend on both sides of the border. Elena's gasp of recognition cut through the air like a blade. "Miguel," she whispered, her voice mixing hope and terror in equal measure. "My brother has come." The approaching riders spread out in a semicircle as they neared the barn, their hands resting casually on their weapons, their dark eyes taking in every detail of the scene before them. Captain Mendoza dismounted with the fluid grace of a man born to the saddle, his spurs chiming softly against the earth as he approached. He was tall for a Mexican, with shoulders broad as an axe handle and eyes that seemed to see straight through to a man's soul. His uniform was dusty from hard riding, but the silver badge on his chest caught the light like a star, and the ivory-handled pistol at his hip carried the weight of absolute authority. His voice, when it came, was quiet as falling snow, but sharp as winter wind. "Sheriff Coleman, Pastor Williams, I am Captain Miguel Mendoza of the Rurales. I have come for my sister, Elena, who was taken from Mexican soil by men who call themselves civilized." His English was perfect, educated in mission schools, but carrying an accent that made every word sound like a barely contained threat. The sheriff's face went pale as old bone. International incidents were far beyond his experience, and the sight of 20 armed Mexican lawmen on American soil made his stomach churn with possibilities too terrible to contemplate. "Captain Mendoza, your sister was not taken. She was detained for her own protection and moral guidance." Miguel Mendoza's eyes found Elena, and Thomas saw the flash of pure fury that crossed the captain's features as it took in her torn dress, her tear-stained face, and the iron chains lying abandoned at her feet. When he spoke again, his voice carried the promise of violence that would make the Apache Wars look like a Sunday picnic. My sister was imprisoned in darkness for 3 days without trial, without evidence, without even the courtesy of being allowed to speak in her own defense. In Mexico, we have a name for men who cage innocent women like animals. His hand moved to his pistol grip, and every one of his men shifted in their saddles, ready to turn Millbrook into a battleground at their captain's signal. But Elena stepped between her brother and the townsman, her voice carrying a strength that 3 days of imprisonment had only made stronger. "Miguel, wait! There is one man here who showed me kindness when all others showed cruelty. Senor McKenna risked everything to free me from that cage. He is not like the others." Her words seemed to cut through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds, and Captain Mendoza's fierce gaze turned to Thomas with new interest. Thomas felt the weight of 20 pairs of eyes upon him, judging his worth, measuring his character, deciding whether he would live or die in the next few heartbeats. But he met the captain's stare without flinching, his voice steady as stone when he spoke. "Captain, your sister is innocent of any wrongdoing. I saw it in her eyes, heard it in her voice, and felt it in my conscience. No Christian man could stand by and watch injustice parade itself as righteousness." And in that moment of perfect silence, with the morning sun climbing higher and the dust settling around them like the residue of broken dreams, everyone present realized that this confrontation would decide far more than one girl's fate. It would determine whether courage or cowardice would define the soul of Millbrook for generations to come. Captain Mendoza studied Thomas for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to weigh the cowboy's soul against some internal standard of honor and justice. The silence stretched like a rope pulled tight, ready to snap into violence or understanding. Finally, the captain's stern features softened almost imperceptibly, and he inclined his head in a gesture of grudging respect. "Senor McKenna," he said, his voice carrying the formal courtesy of a man raised to honor courage wherever he found it, "you have shown my family a kindness that we will not forget. In a land where prejudice often masquerades as law, you chose to see truth instead of color, innocence instead of guilt. This speaks well of your character." But Pastor Williams, his face flushed with righteous indignation and wounded pride, stepped forward with his Bible clutched against his chest like a shield. "Captain Mendoza, you speak of innocence, but what of the corruption she brought to our community? What of the moral decay that follows when foreign influences corrupt our Christian values? This woman must answer for her sins before God and man." The captain's expression hardened like steel cooling in winter air. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather portfolio worn smooth by years of official use. From within it, he pulled a piece of paper that seemed to glow white in the morning light. "Pastor Williams, perhaps you should examine this before you speak further of sin and corruption." Elena gasped as she recognized the document, and her eyes filled with tears that caught the sunlight like diamonds. "Miguel, you kept it after all these years?" The captain nodded solemnly and handed the paper to Sheriff Coleman, whose weathered hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the official document. The sheriff's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, surprise, and finally a dawning recognition that made him look up at Elena with new eyes. His voice came out as a whisper, but in the morning stillness it carried to every ear. This is a certificate of completion from the Sacred Heart Convent School in San Antonio. Elena Vasquez graduated with highest honors in Christian education and moral philosophy. She served 2 years as a teacher of young children before returning home to care for her ailing parents. The paper passed from hand to hand among the townsmen, and with each reading, their expressions of certainty crumbled like sandcastles before an incoming tide. Pastor Williams stared at the document as if it were written in a foreign language, his confident condemnation faltering in the face of official contradiction. But Captain Mendoza was not finished. He reached into his portfolio again and withdrew a second document, this one bearing the official seal of the Mexican government. And this, Pastor Williams, is Elena's certificate of virtue from the church authorities in Mexico City. She took a sacred vow of purity when she began teaching, a vow that has never been broken despite the trials life has placed before her. Thomas felt Elena's hand squeeze his, and when he looked down at her tear-stained face, he saw not shame or fear, but the quiet dignity of a woman whose truth had finally been allowed to shine. The crowd of townsmen shuffled their feet and avoided each other's eyes, the weight of their misjudgment settling upon them like lead blankets. Sheriff Coleman cleared his throat, his voice heavy with the burden of official responsibility and personal regret. Miss Vasquez, it appears that a great injustice has been done to you. The town of Millbrook owes you an apology and whatever reparation we can offer for your suffering. But Elena shook her head, her voice carrying a strength that 3 days of imprisonment had only refined into something purer and harder. Sheriff Coleman, I do not seek revenge against those who wronged me, but I do seek understanding. Why was it so easy for you to believe the worst of me? Why did my word mean nothing while the accusations of strangers carried the weight of absolute truth? The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, bitter and impossible to ignore. Thomas saw grown men lower their heads in shame. Women clutched their shawls tighter against the chill of recognition. The ugly truth was written in their faces. Prejudice had worn the mask of justice, and fear had spoken in the voice of righteousness. Pastor Williams, his face pale as winter snow, stepped forward with his Bible still clutched in his trembling hands. Miss Vasquez, we acted in haste and judgment without seeking the full truth. We allowed fear to cloud our Christian charity, and for this I ask your forgiveness and God's mercy upon our souls. Elena looked at the pastor for a long moment, her dark eyes seeming to weigh his words against his actions. Finally, she nodded slowly, her voice soft but clear as mountain water. I forgive you, Pastor Williams, but forgiveness must be accompanied by change, or it becomes meaningless as morning mist. Captain Mendoza surveyed the assembled crowd with eyes that seemed to catalog each face, each expression of shame and recognition. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of law and the wisdom of experience. People of Millbrook, my sister's ordeal has revealed something important about your community. You have good hearts, but you allowed fear to poison your judgment. The question now is what you will do with this knowledge. Thomas felt the weight of the moment settling around him like dust after a great storm. Eleanor was free, her innocence proven, her dignity restored. But the deeper questions remained unanswered. What would the town learn from this experience? Would they grow stronger and wiser, or would they simply find new targets for their fear and prejudice? If you witnessed a community confronting its own capacity for injustice, would you trust them to change, or would you believe that some lessons can only be learned through pain? As if reading his thoughts, Eleanor turned to face the crowd of townspeople, her small frame somehow commanding their complete attention. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the dusty ground. And in that golden light, she looked like something more than human, a living reminder of what they had almost destroyed through their prejudice and haste. "People of Millbrook," she began, her accented English carrying clearly in the still air. "3 days ago, you saw a Mexican girl and believed the worst. Today, you see documents and certificates that prove my virtue and education. But I ask you, which version of me was real? The answer is both. I was always the same person with the same heart, the same values, the same capacity for good and evil as any human soul. What changed was not me, but your willingness to see me clearly." Mrs. Henderson, the woman whose accusations had started this entire ordeal, stepped forward with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Her voice broke as she spoke, years of buried shame and regret pouring out like water from a broken dam. "Miss Vasquez, I was the one who spoke first against you. I let my fear of strangers poison my tongue with lies and suspicion. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I beg for it anyway, because carrying this shame is more than my old heart can bear." Eleanor walked to the older woman and took her hands, her touch gentle as a mother's blessing. "Mrs. Henderson, fear makes fools of us all sometimes. What matters is what we do when we recognize our mistakes. Will you help me teach the children of Millbrook that kindness is stronger than suspicion, that understanding defeats prejudice?" The older woman nodded vigorously, her tears falling freely now, washing away years of bitterness and mistrust. Around them, other townspeople began to step forward, offering their own apologies and promises to do better. Thomas watched this transformation with wonder, seeing how Eleanor's grace had turned what could have been a moment of vengeance into an opportunity for healing. But Captain Mendoza raised his hand for silence, his expression still serious despite the mood of reconciliation. "Words of regret are easy to speak, but change requires action. My sister has suffered 3 days of imprisonment, public humiliation, and the threat of permanent exile from a community she wished only to serve. What will Millbrook do to prove that this lesson has truly been learned?" Sheriff Coleman stepped forward, removing his hat with the respect due to a solemn oath. "Captain Mendoza, Miss Vasquez, I propose that we establish a council of justice that includes voices from all communities in our area, American, Mexican, and Indian. No one will be condemned again without fair hearing and proper evidence. And we will build a school where children of all backgrounds can learn together, so the next generation grows up seeing neighbors instead of strangers." Pastor Williams nodded emphatically, his voice stronger now that he had found his moral footing again. "The church will provide the land and funding for such a school, and Miss Vasquez, if you would consent to teach there, we would consider it an honor to have someone of your education and character guiding our children's learning." Thomas felt a warmth spread through his chest as he watched Elena's face light up with something that transcended forgiveness and approached joy. This was what she had always wanted, not revenge for the wrongs done to her, but the opportunity to make something beautiful from the ashes of injustice. "I accept your offer," Elena said, her voice carrying the strength of new purpose. "But I have one condition. The school must welcome all children, regardless of their family's origin, their skin color, or their parents' mistakes. Education is the light that drives out the darkness of ignorance and fear." Captain Mendoza smiled then, the first genuine expression of happiness Thomas had seen on the man's stern features. "My sister, you have turned enemies into allies and hatred into hope. Our father would be proud." He turned to address Thomas directly, his voice formal but warm with respect. "Senor McKenna, you risked everything to defend an innocent stranger. In our family, such courage is not forgotten. If you ever have need of friends, you need only send word to the rurales, and we will come." Thomas felt the weight of 20 years of loneliness lift from his shoulders like morning mist touched by sunlight. He had acted from conscience alone, expecting nothing but trouble for his kindness. Instead, he had found something precious, a community reborn through trial, a woman whose courage matched her grace, and the knowledge that sometimes doing right creates rewards beyond imagination. But Elena was not finished surprising them. She walked to the abandoned barn, its door still hanging open like the mouth of some defeated beast. With her small hands, she began to gather the iron chains that had held her prisoner, their weight nearly too much for her slender frame to bear. Every eye watched as she dragged the heavy links to the center of the group, the metal scraping against stone with sounds like grinding teeth. "These chains bound me in darkness for 3 days," she said, her voice carrying across the silence like a prayer. "But they also bound you to fear, to prejudice, to the comfort of judging others without knowing their hearts. I propose we melt them down and use the iron to make a bell for our new school. Every time it rings, it will remind us that freedom and education go hand in hand, that no one should be chained by the ignorance of others." The symbolism was perfect, and Thomas saw its impact ripple through the crowd like stones thrown into still water. Mrs. Henderson was the first to step forward and help Elena lift the chains, followed by Pastor Williams, then Sheriff Coleman, until half the town was working together to carry the instruments of injustice toward the blacksmith's forge. As the crowd began to disperse, making plans for the school and discussing the changes they wanted to make, Thomas found himself alone with Elena beside the empty barn. The morning sun was reaching toward noon, painting everything in shades of gold and promise. Elena looked up at him with eyes that held depths he was only beginning to fathom. "Senor McKenna," she said softly, "you saved more than my life when you opened that door. You saved my faith in human goodness, my belief that courage still exists in this world. How can I ever repay such a gift?" Thomas looked at this remarkable woman who had turned imprisonment into triumph, hatred into hope, and felt something stir in his heart that he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it, the recognition that his long winter of solitude might be ending. "Miss Vasquez," he said, his voice rough with emotions he'd kept buried for too long. "Seeing you turn this injustice into something beautiful is payment enough for any man. But if you truly want to repay me, teach those children well. Help them grow up in a world where the color of a person's skin matters less than the content of their character." Elena smiled then, and Thomas thought he had never seen anything as beautiful as hope reflected in a pair of dark eyes that had looked into hell and chose to see heaven instead. "I will teach them, Senor McKenna, and perhaps if you would consent to visit the school sometimes, you could teach them about courage, how one man's conscience can light a fire that burns away the darkness of an entire community's fear." As they walked back toward town together, Thomas realized that his act of rebellion had created something far greater than he had ever imagined. Elena Vasquez was free, but more importantly, Millbrook was free too. Free from the chains of prejudice that had bound its heart. Free to become the kind of community where justice and mercy walked hand in hand. The empty barn stood behind them like a monument to what they had overcome, its open door framing a view of endless sky and boundless possibility. And in that sky, Thomas thought he could see Sarah's face, smiling with approval at the choice he had made, the courage he had found, and the hope he had helped create. 6 months later, the sound of the Freedom Bell rang across Millbrook for the first time, calling children of every background to learn together in a school built from the ashes of injustice. Elena Vasquez stood in the doorway, watching her students play together without seeing differences in skin color or family origin. And sometimes, when the afternoon light slanted just right through the windows, she would see a familiar figure on horseback, Thomas McKenna, riding past, with a smile that spoke of friendship, respect, and perhaps something deeper growing in the fertile ground of shared purpose and mutual admiration. The town that had once imprisoned an innocent girl had learned that true justice cannot be chained, that courage is contagious, and that sometimes it takes just one person willing to stand alone against the crowd to show everyone else the difference between right and wrong. Would you have risked everything to free an innocent soul from the darkness of unjust imprisonment? Subscribe for more powerful stories of courage conquering fear, and click on the next video to discover how one woman's forgiveness transformed an entire community's understanding of what it truly means to live with honor. The next story will show you a twist of fate so powerful it'll change how you see justice forever.